the past few days, we've had a member of Congress openly lobby the Electoral College to cast their votes for someone other than Trump. We've had Time Magazine lobbying. We've had the Clinton campaign saying, hey, the electors should consider Russian interference before when they cast their votes. I mean, this is just insanity what we're seeing.
Hello, everyone, and welcome into CrushTheStreet.com. I'm Kenneth Amaduri, and I'm joined today with the very popular Michael Snyder of the Economic Collapse blog. He's a former Washington, D.C. attorney who spends his time now writing, speaking, and educating people through his website and books. He's also the author of both The Rapture Verdict and The Beginning of the End. Michael Snyder, thanks for joining me.
Kenneth, it's great to be with you. Thank you for having me on today.
Of course. Let's start off with fake news and the fact that the mainstream media is labeling everyone else who doesn't go along with their agenda as fake news spreaders, perpetrators of fake news. And to me, of course, it's a backlash against their credibility collapsing and falling off a cliff post the election, post Brexit. Michael, let's get your thoughts on this.
Well, I certainly don't want to be known as fake news, but my website did actually make a list that was put out by an organization called Prop or Not. And they put out a list of about 200 websites, and the Washington Post actually referred to their list, and then didn't publish their list, but referred to them as saying, hey, this organization has put together a list of sites that are, publishing Russian propaganda. So the Economic Collapse blog was on there, and endoftheamericandream.com. So my websites were about two out of the about 200 websites they put up there. But it's alarming, because what happened now, we had the election, and Hillary Clinton lost, and so Hillary Clinton and the Democrats and the establishment, they're trying to figure out, well, how in the world did we lose? And one of the things they've are focusing on is fake news. Now, there is fake news out there where people are putting out fake news stories that are not true at all, just to get clicks and whatever, and we've all seen that. But they're using the term fake news and putting it on the alternative media. People like you and me and so many of the other websites that and news sources that are out there. So they're coming after us. They want to attack us because they, before we were kind of an annoyance to them. We were, they didn't like us, but they didn't take us that seriously. But now that it's cost them this election, this historic election, and they consider us to be one of the reasons why that happened, well, now they got to come after us. So
the ratings are down. New York Times, the trust that people have in these news outlets have fallen off a cliff, and many are calling this the end of the mainstream news. And do you see this as the end, or are the people, the citizens of this world, waking up to this fact?
Well, I think there's been a transformation where at one time the big corporate media behemoths could be the gatekeepers. I mean, if you wanted to get into the newspaper, you had to go through them. If you wanted to get on television, you had to go through them. If you wanted to get readers, you had to go through them, whether it was their publishing houses, their television networks, whatever it was, but they could be the gatekeepers. But now the internet has democratized information and the news to a very large degree. And so, they've been losing readers for a year. They've been losing viewers. And then, a big thing with this past election is they were just so in the tank for Hillary, so anti-Trump. I mean, in the past, at least the mainstream media tried to keep a facade of objectivity to the whole thing, but this time that was just out the window. They were against Trump. They hated Trump, every day running negative stories about Trump. And so it was completely obvious who they were wanted to win. And so now that Trump has won, and people are going to remember all of that, and so they've lost a lot of credibility, and we can see, these people are not objective. They don't have our best interest in mind, but they're pushing an agenda.
Well, Michael, one of the things we want to cover today is what's going on in the Middle East here, and something the mainstream media is not covering is this Turkey, declaring war on Syria. Maybe they would call this fake news. I don't know. But I'm hardly hearing anything about this. So I want you to please educate us, and I want to discuss this a little bit with you here.
Yeah, a lot of your listeners may not even know what's going on, may not even realize what's going on, because it's not being reported in the West. But Turkish military forces actually invaded Syrian soil on August 24th, a few months ago. And at the time, we were being told that, the tanks are rolling in, but they're just going to fight ISIS. They're just going to set up a buffer zone in northern Syria to help protect some of the refugees. Then they started getting into some clashes with the Kurds, and they're like, well, they don't want the Kurds to take over so much territory, and so we were told that they would only go in to a limited extent and only for a limited reason. But then now we're finding out something completely different, where the president of Turkey, President Erdogan, is openly admitting what the goal is, and it wasn't reported in the Western media, especially not the U.S. media. But let me give you the quote, because he told the press why they are in Syria. Here's the quote, "Why did we enter? We do not have an eye on Syrian soil. The issue is to provide lands to their real owners. That is to say, we are there for the establishment of justice. We entered there to end the rule of the tyrant al-Assad, who terrorizes with state terror." So the president of Turkey, and basically in Turkey after the attempted coup, fake coup, whatever you want to call it, he's more all-powerful than ever. He's almost kind of like a Turkish version of Hitler, although here in the U.S. we say good things about him because he's supposed to be our friend, but he's really kind of a tyrant, a crazy guy. But President Erdogan is openly saying, hey, we invaded Syria, and the goal is to take out the Assad regime, and presumably they're not going to leave until they accomplish their goal. And so that's basically a declaration of war on the Syrian government, and it puts them directly opposed to, Hezbollah, which is helping the Syrian government, puts them in direct conflict with Iran, who's in there and helping Syria. But most importantly, it puts them potentially in direct conflict with Russia, because Russia has been propping up the regime, helping the Assad regime retake territory, has totally turned the tide of the war. And that's why Turkey had to intervene ultimately, is because the rebels that they were funding and supporting and allowing to use their hospitals, including ISIS fighters who go back and forth over the border using Turkish hospitals. Barack Obama knows all about this. He also knows that ISIS was selling oil, shipping oil on an industrial scale into Turkey, where it was sold to the rest of the world. Obama knows all about that, didn't do anything to stop it either. But Turkey was doing all that they can to help the rebels, including ISIS, to try to overthrow the Assad government. It was working at first, then Russia and Iran and Hezbollah came in, turned the tide of the war, and so then they were losing. So that's why Turkey had intervened to keep the war alive, because the rebels were losing. And so Turkey's been involved in this war all along, but now they're directly involved with tanks, with soldiers, with their own military in the fighting in Syria. Now, how this can involve the United States. Well, Turkey's a member of NATO. Right. And so if shooting begins, and there's already been some incidents where, there's been airstrikes which have hit Turkish forces. There have been some things, so already there's some shooting going on. But if Russia and Turkey just start going into full-blown conflict with one another, well, that could drag the rest of NATO, including the United States, into a war in the Middle East. So this could potentially be very, very destabilizing. Potentially could be a spark which could start World War III
Wow.
So it's something that I'm extremely concerned about, but we're not hearing anything about in the U.S. media, really.
Yeah, and that's what's amazing to me is all of this is going on, but yet they've masked it. They've covered it up in a way that has kept all of us, all of us who aren't paying attention at least, who aren't following guys like yourself, completely blind to what is going on here. And I guess that's where Trump comes in. I'm wondering what your thoughts are with Trump and if he's beholden to the mainstream narrative, and how do you think it'll play out? How do you think he will respond to what is going on in the Middle East regarding all of this?
Well, I think Trump has a different perspective. He's, at least during the campaign, he wasn't so much of a warmonger. He's talking about, working with Russia to fight ISIS in Syria, and elsewhere in the Middle East, and trying to have a better relationship with Russia. And Trump says he's got a secret plan for ISIS. We don't know what it is because he says he doesn't want to telegraph it, but. We'll see. But many on the left are concerned that Donald Trump does have a temper, and he does have a temper. Now, Hillary Clinton actually has more of a temper, but and so that's another thing. But Donald Trump does have a temper, and so something goes not his way, and he gets upset about it, and then could he just start bombing people like crazy? I don't know. But
he did say he wants to bomb ISIS in a big way, and he used eighth grade vocabulary to do that in some of his speeches. And he said that he's going to go after him and not fight ISIS with one arm behind our back like we've been doing this whole time. Do you see this as a reality with Trump here?
Yeah, well, I think that Trump wants to do something against ISIS. And so in Iraq and Syria, we could see the U.S. step up a campaign against ISIS, which could be good. But on the other hand, I mean, Iraq is one thing, but in Syria, we've got to be so careful because we have not been invited to be there to participate in anything going on there, but Russia has. And so we need to step carefully because, the Obama administration a while back said they were openly considering hitting Syrian targets for the first time, directly attacking Syrian military positions. And the Russians were like, no, don't you do that because our forces are mixed in. We're working with the Syrian military, so you could be hitting Russian forces if you do that. So hopefully Trump will take a much different approach than that. But Trump's going to get in there, and he's going to be surrounded by these generals, the guys from the Pentagon, who are very anti-Russian at this point. And sometimes with Trump makes a decision based on the last person that he listened to. So, he's going to be surrounded by all these military advisors that are very hawkish, very anti-Russian. And so throughout the campaign, people, Trump said he wants a good relationship with Russia. People assume that our relationship with Russia would improve if he got in. But I'm a little concerned that he's going to be surrounded by all these generals who are telling him how bad Russia is, how we need to, be tough with Russia. And, I'm concerned things could take a bad turn potentially if things don't go well.
Mm. Well, and if Trump does disrupt the mainstream narrative and the agenda of the elite here, what sort of consequences, whether it's economically for the U.S. or, our relations around the world, how does that play out long term for the United States?
Well, already, China's really upset. Trump hasn't even become president yet, and China's very upset that Trump talked to the president of Taiwan. And, China got all bent out of shape about that. They're gearing up for a trade war. They're, saying, hey, we need to get, more nuclear weapons because, this guy Trump, he's crazy. I think our relationship with China is, clearly going to be strained with Trump. And we could see a trade war erupt between the two biggest economies on the planet. And that wouldn't be good. And already in terms of looking around the globe, we've seen a stock boom. Everyone's been looking at stock prices going up and up and up, but that's because so much money is flowing out of the bond markets, where we're seeing, bond yields go up. We're seeing it's becoming harder to borrow money all over the planet. The yield on U.S. Treasuries is going up like crazy. And so, we're seeing things in the bond market which almost resemble the early stages of a bond crash, which would then eventually hit equities later. But I'm very concerned about what we're seeing with bonds right now, and that it was a response to Donald Trump, winning the election. So I'm very concerned about that. And then, of course, over in Europe, we have the situation with Italy. There have been, big banks are failing. I think the potential for a major financial crisis in Europe is, could be, Donald Trump could be facing that very, very early in his term. So there's a lot of potential challenges out there in terms of around the world. But, all this we're talking about, Kenneth, is assuming that Donald Trump actually becomes president, is inaugurated on January 20th, and we're not there yet. People need to realize he hasn't even been elected president yet, officially.
Well, what do you mean by that, sir?
Yeah, what I mean is that under our system, when we vote on election day, we're voting for electors who then elect the president of the United States. It's the Electoral College that actually elects the president of the United States. So right. Everyone's running around calling Donald Trump the president-elect, but that's actually not going to be true until December 19th, when the Electoral College gathers. And they don't gather in one place. They gather in all 50 state capitals and the Washington, D.C., and then they cast their votes. And the vast majority of time, throughout our history, the electors have followed the will of the people more than 99% of the time. But now this time around, there's a group of electors, they call themselves the Hamilton electors, that say, hey, we're not going to follow the will of the people. And it's mostly Democrats, but one Republican has already announced that he is not going to cast his vote for Donald Trump. And he says there's other Republican electors that are going to do the same thing, but he hasn't said how many there are or what their names are. So we that's not confirmed. But we know there's this one guy, and he's been all over television talking about this. And then just within the past few days, we've had a member of Congress openly lobby the Electoral College to cast their votes for someone other than Trump. We've had Time Magazine lobbying. We've had the Clinton campaign saying, hey, the electors should consider Russian interference before when they cast their votes. I mean, this is just insanity what we're seeing. So, but what in order to keep Donald Trump from having 270 electoral votes, they would have to turn 37 Republican electors. Probably not likely to happen. But if they did that, they could throw it into the House of Representatives, and then who knows what would happen from there. But even if we get past December 19th, Kenneth, that's just the first step. Then we get to January 6th, which is when the electoral votes are counted, and a joint session of Congress comes together and counts the electoral votes. Normally a formality, but objections can be raised. Most recently, an objection was raised in 2005 with the second election of George W. Bush. But if one member of the House and one member of the Senate signs an objection in writing and submits it, then it has to be voted on. And both houses of Congress split up and they each vote on the objection. And if it's upheld, any votes covered by the objection are not counted. So they could object to one vote, they could object to all the votes from a particular state, or all the votes.
Wow.
So ultimately, Donald Trump could actually be blocked on January 6th by the joint session of Congress. And that's why this whole thing with Russian interference, Russian hacking, the election was unfair. We're seeing that, Barack Obama's talking about it. He's saying, Obama has ordered all intelligence agencies to gather information about this Russian interference and submit it to him before the end of his term. The Clinton campaign is talking about it and saying electors need to consider it. Members of Congress are coming forward and saying, oh, this is a really big deal. And of course, the mainstream media has been night and day running with this story. But the reason why that's so big is because, number one, it could influence the electoral college, but number two, it could potentially be used by members of Congress on January 6th. If they wanted to make a big move and block Trump from becoming president by saying, "Oh, the election was unfair, it was illegitimate, we can't count and endorse these votes because there was fraud involved, there was foreign intervention, whatever it is," but it gives them justification to do maybe what it is they want to do. Now, all these scenarios might not be likely, they might not happen, but these are the kinds of discussions that are happening in back rooms and in the halls of Congress and among presidential electors right now.
Yeah, I've never seen anything like this where so many people are so upset about a specific candidate and someone actually winning, and the backlash that Donald Trump is receiving. All these different mayors coming out saying they're going to continue to defy whatever comes from the federal level regarding their sanctuary cities, and just the complete backlash, all I can say, for what Donald Trump is standing up for. I recently spoke with Jim Rogers, who also talked about trade wars, and he says, hey, this is bad. This is bad for the U.S. This is bad for the world. And ultimately what Trump is doing is not going to be good for the U.S. long term. Putting tariffs and charging companies for bringing things back over the U.S. border. And I tend to think that, the country needs this. The country needs to have some rules because the problem is we don't have a free market within the borders. We have things like Obamacare and high minimum wages and entitlement programs where companies say, hey, it's too expensive here in the U.S., so I'm going to go elsewhere. And unfortunately, the only way to keep people here is by threatening them. And that's what Donald Trump is essentially doing, saying, hey, we need you to stay here. We're going to try to loosen up some of these rules and regulations. But also, if you leave, we're going to charge you. So what are your thoughts on that and the trade wars? And is this good for the U.S.? Do you like what you're seeing here?
Well, something needed to be done because just look at China. We let them flood our shores with goods, but then we want to sell our cars over there, and they'll cost more than three times as much in China, some of our vehicles, than they do in the United States because of all the tariffs, all the things. So, I mean, our trade it's not free trade. We're being ripped off by China, frankly, and Donald Trump is exactly right about that. But now, if Donald Trump says, hey, we need to, renegotiate these things, we need to make things fair. Well, China's not going to like that because they've been riding the gravy train all these years. They've been getting very wealthy off of us. They've built up their industrial base at our expense. And China doesn't want to, give up, give up their good position, now. And so they're kind of upset about all of this. But, and we've been for decades, we've been running this gigantic trade deficit, which is a massive, massive problem. We are buying far more from the rest of the world than they're buying from us. So we've got all these dollars constantly leaving, and then we've got to borrow them back because we can't pay our bills. But and so it's a vicious cycle. It's a destructive cycle, and the only reason it can continue is because we keep going into more and more debt. And so, but we've enjoyed this high standard of living because we've been able to import massive amounts of goods from overseas at super low prices, go to Walmart or the dollar store, fill up our carts, get all this cheap stuff made out of the country, where it's legal to pay slave labor wages. But in the meanwhile, we've seen tens of thousands of businesses leave. We've seen millions of good paying jobs leave the country. Our manufacturing base destroyed. Formerly great manufacturing cities like Detroit, now is like a ghost town. So something needs to be done about trade, and we need to trade with the rest of the world, but it's got to be fair. It's got to be balanced because we're getting killed. But in the process, China's just not going to say, "Oh yeah, we've been ripping you off for so long. Now let's make it fair." The process of changing the system will be very disruptive, very chaotic, and would cause potentially pain in the short term and maybe midterm. as well. But and so there's not an easy solution. It's not like Donald Trump can flip a switch and then, okay, now our trade is fair and there's been no disruption. So, if we don't do anything, that's bad. If we do something, it's probably going to be bad in the short term and midterm, probably. So, I don't know.
Well, that goes along with the fact that we are at our breaking point, and whatever we do, it's a house of cards, and we're trying to pull something under that house of cards and expecting it not to fall. Unfortunately, I tend to like the direction Donald Trump wants to take the country, and the markets are perceiving it as a positive thing. At least people are anticipating growth. And, if, let's say, he does lower the corporate tax rate from 39% to 15%, that would make sense why the stocks are pricing that in. That's dollars going straight to the bottom line for a lot of these companies. I understand that it's still based on a huge bubble, but what I find concerning is that it's likely to crash on his watch, and the media, the mainstream media, they're masters at packaging whatever you want to call it, the right or conservative thought is doing, and painting them as the reason why things fall apart, blaming capitalism, blaming the free market. And I fear that will happen here with Trump. And, he may not make it 8 years in this whole thing with the way things are going to play out on him.
Yeah, and Barack Obama has really set the stage because when he first came into office, the federal government was $10.6 trillion in debt, and now we're basically $20 trillion in debt, nearly doubling the national debt. And so and when you take all that money and you inject it into the system, it's more than $9 trillion of borrowed money over Barack Obama's 8 years, an average of more than $1.1 trillion a year. Well, what that does is it increases economic activity, because when the government spends money, it ends up in the pockets of ordinary people, who then go on to spend it on goods and services that they need. So there's a multiplier effect, just like the Keynesians, talk about. And that when we borrow money, it's taking consumption from the future, bringing it into the present. And when the government spends money, it multiplies. And so we've got these, trillions upon trillions and upon trillions of dollars of extra economic activity, which shouldn't be there because we're living beyond our means. We're consuming far more wealth than we're producing. And so all this economic activity, consumption from the future, we brought into the present. But now, if you took that away, if during the Obama years we only spent what we brought in, if we only consumed what we produced, well, we would be in a rip-roaring depression right now. But because we've been on the greatest debt binge in all of history, not just the federal government, but corporate debt has about approximately doubled since the last financial crisis, or state and local governments, and then of course U.S. households are something like $12 trillion in debt now. And so, all this debt has made the economy look far, far better than it otherwise would have been. But even with all that, Barack Obama is going to be the only president in all of U.S. history to never have a single year when the economy grew by at least 3%. And so, that's with all this government stimulus, all this borrowed money that's been injected into the economy. It's still, depressing performance, stagnating performance. But without all that borrowed money, like I said, we would be in the worst depression right now. And now here comes Donald Trump. And see, Donald Trump's going to be facing a dilemma, because in order to continue just the performance of the economy that we've seen under Obama, Donald Trump has to keep borrowing money at the same rate, in order to achieve a similar performance. But now if Donald Trump says, I don't like all this debt, we're going to start cutting back, well, then that's going to really hurt the economy, and then we'll have a downturn. Everyone will blame him for his bad economic policies. But, but of course, if we continue to go in debt like this, we're literally destroying the future, wiping out the future that our children and our grandchildren are supposed to have, piling all this debt on them. I mean, it's just insanity what we're doing. I mean, it's really criminal what we're doing to future generations of Americans. So, we can't afford to do that. But then if we stop, we immediately get pain. So Donald Trump is going to be facing some very, very hard choices.
I was doing some research and reading about, World War II and World War I and, how these wars really devastated the rest of the world, specifically Europe, and, killed their manufacturing, and how the U.S. basically benefited from all of this. By the end of World War II, having 2/3 of the world's gold and basically all the manufacturing, and which a lot of it led to the boom, the 1950s, the good old days, the Make America Great Again. And I'm just wondering, what would it take for America to have that sort of powerhouse economic force? I mean, something as great as the internet, or obviously all this stuff that's gone on in Silicon Valley has been a benefit to, the United States, or the oil shale boom. Or is it really going to have to be potentially a war that wipes out the wealth of, other countries to keep the U.S. on top, where it is now, or where it was, say, 50, 60 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely need something game-changing to happen. I mean, just if Donald Trump goes in and monkeys with the tax rates and the regulations and whatever, ultimately that's not going to make a significant difference compared to the long-term trends, which are just killing us and which are leading us into a huge downturn. So, I mean, we were fortunate to have the internet come along in the 1990s, and that helped things here, with our country, to a certain extent. But we need something game changing if we're going to turn things around. Ultimately, what we really need to do is go to the heart of the system, and we need to fundamentally change the system. We need to fundamentally change where money comes from. We need to fundamentally change how government spending operates. And and specifically, I'm talking about the Federal Reserve. The debt-based central banking system that we that we use as our system. Well, it's designed to get governments into debt, and we've seen all over the world governments are in record amounts of debt. It's designed to debase the currency, and since the Federal Reserve was created, the value of the U.S. dollar has declined by more than 98%, and the U.S. national debt has got more than 5,000 times larger. It was designed to do those things, and it's happening all over the world. And at this point, more than 99% of the global population lives in a nation that has a central bank. So if we really wanted to change things, we would stop, we would shut down the Federal Reserve, stop using a debt-based currency, and start doing things differently in a fundamental way. But that's not Donald Trump's program. That's not what he's pushing. That's not even on his radar. I don't think Donald Trump wants to fix the current system, but I don't believe that it can be fixed.
Mm-hmm. Well, he has talked about auditing the Fed, and I think he's alluded to it more so, but he hasn't really gone down and fully attacked it. And maybe he's doing that for political reasons, same reason he didn't release his tax returns type of thing, and playing his odds and what would be most politically expedient. Michael Snyder, if people want to learn more about what you do, get your books, where would they go? What would they find?
Yeah, the website I'm primarily known for is the Economic Collapse blog, or if you just go to Google and type in the Economic Collapse, it's the first result that comes up. I also have endoftheamericandream.com and themostimportantnews.com, where you can find all my writing gathered in one place, along with other guest authors and news stories, the most important news stories from all over the world gathered on a single website, themostimportantnews.com. And then my books, all of my books you can find in paperback and for the Kindle on Amazon.com.
Sir, you're an expert. You're, a truth teller, and I really do appreciate you coming on the show. Thanks again. I really do appreciate it.
Oh, thank you, Kenneth. Enjoyed talking with you today, and I think the next few weeks and certainly the months ahead are going to be exceedingly interesting.